Black Sea Fleet headquarters, just in one attack, struck successfully by Storm Shadow in Sevastopol. And of course, Russia views all this territory. It's held referenda, which obviously we have varying degrees of acceptance and belief in. On all this territory, to say this is part of Russian territory. If you go into a Russian government building, into a Russian school, into a Russian website, it will show the seized regions of Ukraine as Russian territory now. But we've been doing strikes on those, and that wasn't a red line. So Sevastopol, not a red line. So either Russia's admitting that these aren't really parts of Russia, and even it doesn't treat them as really parts of Russia, or it accepts that this has already been happening, and what's the difference if it happens on Rostov-on-Don versus Sevastopol? It's full of Russians, it's Russian territory, the Russians regard it as Russian territory. And Kursk, as you well give the example, not really a different reaction to that, to fighting anywhere else. And I think it does show the weakness of this position that Russia's taken.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Justin Crump, a British Army veteran and CEO of the strategic advisory firm Sibylline. Justin, welcome to Frontline.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
To begin with, let's talk about the UN General Assembly that, of course, is taking place in New York at the moment. President Zelensky's having various meetings with world leaders to promote his victory plan. How optimistic are you that the Western allies of Ukraine will adopt the victory plan?
I think if you look at the Western support for Ukraine throughout the war, I think it's been far more than Russia expected, intended, or would like, and it's fallen far short of what Ukraine expected, hoped for, or would like throughout. So I think my default view on all this is I don't think anything will ever be accepted without reservation from the Western end, just in part because there are so many stakeholders involved in all of this. It was amazing, actually, the unity that was achieved very early on after the Russian invasion. And again, Moscow almost certainly didn't expect that within its planning, let alone anything else that then occurred, and was sure that we were divided and we wouldn't pull together. And I think the shock for the EU was so strong that actually it pulled a lot of people together at the time. But there's just been all these fractures throughout. So I think, as with anything where you have a large group of people trying to achieve consensus, everything always gets watered down, inevitably. And the focus should be more on what will be supported and achieved, rather than 100% unequivocal backing of the plan, because Ukraine hasn't, sadly, experienced that at any point so far in the conflict. And one wonders a little bit if it's like any negotiation that you enter into, that you potentially ask for more than you need on the basis you only get half as much. So you pitch higher. You see people do it in business for budgets. People ask for more than they think they'll need. So when they get knocked back, they still get what they actually truly needed. And I think there's probably an element of that as well in what Ukraine will ask for, that they'll ask for the world, and then hope that they get more than they have and that there's enough support. So I'd say I'm moderately optimistic that support will continue. The question becomes, is it enough to tip the balance, or is it falling just short and therefore not delivering a significant enough impact? And you've had the same relationship with all the military support to date, for example, where I'd characterize it as just about enough, just about in time, mostly. I think in terms of what we've seen, it's certainly kept Ukraine in the fight. It hasn't offered them a decisive edge. But again, it's allowing them to stay in. But of course, at some point, you have to make a commitment. Are we going to help Ukraine to the point that we help them win? Clearly we're in it to win it, or are we going to carry on holding back? But at some point, this is pointless, because if we're not going to help them win the conflict, what are we doing? If we don't want to just protract it needlessly, then there needs to be another option. So that's, I think, my rule.
You've done that up really well. It's almost, at the moment, it feels like the Western allies of Ukraine are helping Ukraine to not lose, but not doing enough to help them win.
Well, that's certainly what Ukrainian soldiers would tell you. Grateful for everything we get, and we don't want to appear, sort of ungrateful about it. But yeah, you're not. Come on, if we're in it to win it, give us the permission to use these weapons across the border. For goodness' sake, the Russians can literally stand there and taunt us, and we can't do anything about it until they step into Ukraine. They're very clear on that.
Yeah. So in terms of what the victory plan may entail, and we still await to see the exact details from President Zelensky, clearly weaponry, military aid is going to be a big part of it. Just to focus on, for instance, the Storm Shadows and the Scout missiles to begin with, because we are still waiting for approval for Ukraine to be allowed to use those weapons to hit targets inside Russia. Why do you think there is such a delay? It appears to be coming from the White House. Why is there still this reticence, this fear of escalation, when a lot of people would say, look, one of the big lessons from the Kursk incursion is that a lot of these so-called red lines that Putin has put in are just bluffs. If you can physically invade Russian territory and he doesn't reach for the nuclear button, surely that exposes these red lines as bluffs.
And of course, Putin's done such a great job over at least 16 years, if you go back to Georgia and so on, of pushing the West red lines and just ignoring them, going past them, and nothing happens. So, I mean, they've actually shown us the way in which they respond to red lines, which is creep over them and keep pushing them. And as you say, we have done that multiple times in the conflict. But it shows the level at which Russian misinformation, disinformation, information warfare, propaganda, and other activities have been effective, that they keep creating this paralysis of support, these massive crises of conscience about helping Ukraine win, and these entirely ridiculous, when you think about it, constraints on where and how things can be used. And I would point to the use of Storm Shadow already, obviously inside territory that is contested, so Crimea alone. The Black Sea Fleet headquarters, just in one attack, struck successfully by Storm Shadow in Sevastopol. And of course, Russia views all this territory. It's held referenda, which obviously we have varying degrees of acceptance and belief in. On all this territory, to say this is part of Russian territory. If you go into a Russian government building, into a Russian school, into a Russian website, it will show the seized regions of Ukraine as Russian territory now. But we've been doing strikes on those, and that wasn't a red line. So Sevastopol, not a red line. So either Russia's admitting that these aren't really parts of Russia, and even it doesn't treat them as really parts of Russia, or it accepts that this has already been happening, and what's the difference if it happens on Rostov-on-Don versus Sevastopol? It's full of Russians, it's Russian territory, the Russians regard it as Russian territory. And Kursk, as you well give the example, not really a different reaction to that, to fighting anywhere else. And I think it does show the weakness of this position that Russia's taken, but it isn't weak because it's worked, and we're still debating this. And we have to have meetings, and of course the expectation of a big announcement of how one side in a war is going to use its weapons. It's like sort of going out there in 1944 and saying exactly what we're going to do on D-Day and having an announcement about it and a meeting about it first and a press release about the military operation before you do it. I mean, surely the element of surprise is something you would want to have in the use of these systems. And so also for the Russians, they've achieved this thing where anything we do, we're sort of telling them about it well in advance. They can go and get ready for it. This is not how to fight a war, not the way you choose to fight a war. And so they've achieved success in that area as well. And I think that's, the Russians actually have been very significant in this ability to make us afraid to do what's required to win by making all these threats that they have almost never followed through on. Now, that doesn't mean there wouldn't be an escalation, subversion, sabotage, other acts that we've seen escalating within Europe, but all of those things are being done by Russia to try and not have a direct conflict with NATO. They argue they're in conflict with NATO. They put out propaganda almost nightly that they're in conflict with NATO. They run simulations on their evening TV programs of what a nuclear strike on London would look like, and they've been doing that for 2 years. But the reality is they don't want a war with NATO because they would lose. They're barely winning a war against Ukraine on its own with fairly iffy support from the West. In many ways, it's certainly shy of a massive commitment to win. So they don't want it. They want to threaten it because it scares us and we don't help Ukraine, and that's how they win this war. It's as simple as that. To do things that would actually start a war with NATO, it's a very risky thing. Now, they'd love to break NATO up. They'd love to fracture the alliance so that it loses cohesion. America pulls out of Europe, and the US is no longer supporting the backbone of our defense. They'd love to see that. They'd love to see the Baltics get harassed to the point that there was something that should trigger Article 5 that doesn't, and NATO becomes irrelevant when Article 5 is potentially triggered and it is vetoed and there is no collective defense. These are Russian victories in the long term, but they don't achieve that by doing something that's so clear, say a strike on Poland, that the Poles say, that's it, you're going to face something back for this. Because again, Russia comes out of this badly. They need us to be frightened. They've succeeded in that to the point we're having this debate.
Just on the Storm Shadows, if these are British weapons, and the same for the French-supplied Scout weapons, why do we need the approval of the US government for them to be used by Ukraine if we've given them to Ukraine?
I think there's a few angles to it. There's lots of things talked about, well, they use US systems, or, if you speak to other people, well, of course, some of the data might come from the US, or you speak to someone else and say, well, they can only get them to the target if they use other US systems alongside it. And I think that's all a bit of a bluff. I mean, I think the real point here around that is the fact that we're trying to move forward as an alliance. And if the US doesn't like things, it risks fracturing that unity of moving forward. And of course, no nation truly wants to be the one that absolutely breaks ranks and wades into this and then finds that everyone else didn't follow them. And now they're in a war with Russia and everyone else says you brought that on yourselves. So I think there is this real desire to move forward as an alliance with clear commitment from everyone. So again, if the UK was to just cross the lines, I mean, because on the same point, you could say, well, maybe the Poles should send 50,000 soldiers, armored vehicles and their air force to defend Ukraine. And if they just did that on their own without consulting everyone else, I'm pretty sure the Russians would say, okay, Poland, you're in the fight. And I'm not sure that the UK and France would say, well, we're behind them all the way after they took that unilateral action. I think that's now a Poland-Russia conflict. And again, that's how Russia wins, because they get to pick off nations one by one within NATO. So that temptation to act unilaterally is really, really dangerous, because it would allow nations to actually get broken away from the alliance and eaten one by one. In the worst case, I'm giving a very extreme scenario. I've got no suggestion that Poland's going to go piling into Ukraine. But once upon a time in the world, that's something that could have happened. With NATO, no, we need to move together. We need to maintain collective defence and deterrence. And so the US is really important for this. Now, that said, the UK has been the nation that has pushed boundaries the most, supplying main battle tanks, doing training for pilots before anyone else, even if we didn't supply airframes. We always pushed the boundaries and pushed at Russia's red lines. And there's a reason that the UK is singled out by Russia and Russian propaganda just so often. And, there's this almost constant contemptuous statement that they could just wipe us off the map with their nuclear weapons if they felt like it. But we're the aggressors, in that narrative. It sort of shows actually how annoyed they were, and particularly at Boris Johnson, who sort of, if you go to Kyiv, there are paintings of Boris that local artists have done because they're so grateful for the support he gave right at the start of the conflict that drew the lines, and that the UK said, actually, we will back you. We feel we should and we must. That set the tone for others. And so we are the people pushing for this, because we always have been pushing to do more for Ukraine. The US are the people that are the gatekeepers, frankly, because they're 50% of the military support and the heart of the NATO military alliance.
And again, on the point about American approval for the use of Storm Shadows, there might be some who go, well, look, Ukraine have got them already. As you mentioned, they've been using them in Crimea. Why not just use them on military targets inside Russia? And what are the Western allies going to do? I mean, as far as we're aware, there was no prior approval of the Kursk incursion. Had they said we're thinking of physically invading Russia, they probably would have been told, absolutely do not do that. So is that something Zelensky will have privately considered?
I'm sure they thought about it. It's like, we got these things, we could use them. But of course, what guarantees were given when we offered them? And the deal was very much, you can have these and the support and the know-how and the engineering support and everything else to use them, but on the basis that they don't cross this particular line. And of course, a nation that's under desperate threat might say, well, forget that, we just need to do this. But the Ukrainians know if they did that, that would be the end of any further support for them, potentially international pressure to say, right, stop this conflict. So I'm sure they thought about it. I'd sure be thinking about it and saying, well, we could just do it anyway, but that would be the only chance we'd get to use them, because after that, you might find that a lot of things stop happening for us. So, and Ukraine has occasionally, done things that I think in private aroused a certain degree of annoyance from its backers. And I think conversations are had afterwards sometimes about things. And I think, of course, the Ukrainians go, well, we're the ones in the battle for survival. You're not, sorry, we're seeking forgiveness, not asking permission. But I think on this one, it's such heavily loaded and it's such a red line, it's not worth them doing it overall. And of course, Ukraine is adapting and finding other ways to strike at these targets. They're developing their own missiles and know-how. They were doing that before the conflict. They've obviously accelerated that. And they are developing longer-range weapons of their own. And if nothing else, being able to be allowed to use Western weapons within the operational theatre, if you like, so not within the internationally recognised boundaries of Russia, well, then whatever they can make, which is probably going to be quite a low rate of production, at least they can then use that outside the borders. So, hey, you know what? We'll keep using ATACMS and Storm Shadow inside our borders, and we use our low-rate production indigenous weapon systems for things further afield, which is what they are doing. But imagine the effect, of course, if out of a clear blue sky one morning they could use the whole lot, against Russian military targets, logistics hubs, training grounds, railway networks, all the things that are supporting the effort on the front lines, and they could hit them at the same time. That would be closer to a knockout blow that would help the front lines. Dribbling attacks creates problems for the Russians, but it isn't a knockout blow. And Russia's got that problem against Ukraine itself, even with their access to weapons, that they can't deliver knockout blows on Ukrainian infrastructure They just can't mass the amount of weapons and systems needed to do that. And Ukraine faces the same problem, of course, but Ukraine has nowhere to hide. Russian troops at the moment can basically cross the border into Russia and don't have to fear a storm shadow. They might have to fear an improvised drone, and they should be at the moment, because those are getting 1,000+ miles into Russia and hitting very high value targets. But in general, you're safe in Russia in a way that you're not safe in Crimea and you're not safe in the Donbass.
It's a really good point you raised, Justin, about how, routinely through this war, there has been a fixation on certain weapons at certain points, whether it was main battle tanks, F-16, Storm Shadows now. But really, it's about the suite of military aid that you can provide. And are there further weapon systems that aren't currently being talked about that should be on the table? I mean, some people mention the JASSMs, these joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, I think, that the Americans have. Would that make a big difference?
Look, I think never in warfare has there been a silver bullet, and very rarely has there been a real capability step change that led to a dramatic change in things. I mean, the few of them being, for example, the tank was something that was a new paradigm in warfare at the time. There's a reason we've been fascinated with them for over 100 years, and now the fact that some of them get destroyed in the battlefield is seen as almost unthinkable. It's the end of the tank. Well, of course, no weapon's ever been inviolate on the battlefield. No thing really has ever been the one tool that if you have it, everything's over, apart from nuclear weapons, which is so destructive that they've entered their own realm. And we have a conflict here that could be nuclear and isn't, because it just can't cross over into that unless it becomes existential. So they've had a totally different effect. So on the battlefield itself, a few more missiles of a different type aren't going to change the balance on their own. A few F-16s don't change the balance. A whole new Air Force equipped with F-16s in their thousands, does. But it comes down to how many can you get, how many can you use, can you support, maintain, supply any weapon system, can you get it to the target, are people trained to use it, are they trained to maintain it? The systems are incredibly complex. And then you have to combine all of that in time and space to achieve an effect on the enemy. And again, it's that difference between 1,000 missiles fired at a target over a year versus 1,000 missiles fired in 10 minutes. One of them is going to leave people reeling. And something that's often missed in warfare is it's not about killing all the enemy on the battlefield or anything else. Actually, in general, this is not a good example of that in this conflict, but in general, casualty rates are quite low for the amount of people fighting. It's the shock effect of losing several people in a short period of time that generally causes things to disintegrate. But very rarely are whole units absolutely destroyed in an attack and overrun. It's about, you affect 10 to 20% casualties on a unit and it breaks. People just won't stay around. The remaining 80% don't hang around after, their mates are starting to fall in most conflicts. So it is achieved by that sort of weight of fire in a short period of time, that weight of effect. And you've seen what happens, e.g. the Kursk offensive. Once surprise is lost, momentum is lost, it goes very static very quickly. So if you have things, it's about how you use them, how you integrate them, and how you achieve success in the window of time before your enemy can adapt that counts. So systems that help that are great, but they've got to be in sufficient numbers. Otherwise, it's just slightly tilting the balance. And what's a very finely balanced conflict, really, at the moment between these two sides. So fine adjustments count. But the parallel is Iran-Iraq in the 1980s, which really went backwards and forwards a bit, and then the front lines were stable for years on end with incremental movements because they were just balanced so closely, and nothing really changed the course of that conflict in terms of supply from any side. And that's what we're seeing here. I can't see anything other than the complete regeneration of the Ukrainian Air Force, huge munition supply that would change things quickly. I think all of it's incremental gains. And that's one of the reasons why military aid doesn't just flood forward, because there's no point in giving 2,000 armored vehicles if there's no one trained to drive them or maintain them. They're just a target sitting in a parking lot. So you've got to think of the whole system and then think about what effect you're going to achieve with that whole system in this incredibly complex environment of the modern battlefield.
And it's interesting how President Zelensky is stressing the need for urgency, and he wants to get the victory plan approved in the next few months. To what extent is that informed by what happens in November and the US presidential election? And also, do you think, because a lot of people think that a second Trump presidency is bad news for Ukraine, are we overstating that fear?
I mean, I think it's reasonable fear, because I don't think anyone quite knows what a second Trump presidency would bring or look like or lead to. I mean, I think we just don't know. So, I mean, I think, of course, at the moment, he's particularly anti-Iran in recent things, for example. And they're closely allied with Russia and doing things. So I think this idea that he's pro-Russia and would support Russia, is not necessarily a given. It's much more complicated than that. And incidentally, I think what Russia would like to see in the US presidential election, frankly, is a highly contested Harris victory that's narrow enough that the US descends into anarchy. Actually, that's what they'd really like to see, is a complete disabled US, rather than a Trump one where they actually still don't know which way he'll jump. And that's one of the reasons why their own misinformation is pushing both sides and just trying to create division, because division serves them. Division in the UK serves them. It's one of the reasons they push things here as well. These divisive messages that turn us on ourselves, paralyze ourselves, and then they say, well, why? You've got so many problems at home. Why are you helping Ukraine? That's money you could have at home, right? And these are the messages, as we've seen and has been exposed recently, actually being pushed directly from Moscow. So it's unclear exactly which way policy will go under Trump. But certainly if you're Ukraine, you're sort of like, you're rolling the dice of what that looks like. In a way, they're probably not with the current administration. I mean, the current administration has been quite slow and hesitant in giving them everything they could have had or should have had. We've got aid at the moment that's going to run out shortly, that the intent is to ask to have extended from the US side. That limits what it can be used for. If it's even accepted, that can be used. So again, pledged aid to supply existing US military stocks to Ukraine and then backfill them from US suppliers, that has not been used. And that's going to time out. So again, is the US doing everything it can? Clearly not at the moment under the current administration. And I'm sure that Zelensky's team are considering that too and saying, well, actually, is Trump worse? Or can we influence him to say, look, actually, I know you think Russia's great, but it really isn't. They're in bed with Iran that you really hate right now. So do you really want to deal with them, or would you help us win? And, I think there's room for negotiation on that. But they have a window of certainty. They now know where the UK is standing, which wasn't a given a few months ago. So they do have a period of certainty. They want to push and they want to influence things again before that period of greater uncertainty arrives, without a doubt. But it's not necessarily bad for them, whatever the outcome is. But of course, you want to work with what you know you have.
And just finally, Justin, what is your assessment of the current situation on the front line, both in the east of Ukraine, where Russia continues to make incremental advances, but also in Kursk?
It's one of those things. People say, what's the effect of the French Revolution? And you can still say it's too early to say. And I think, what's the effect of Kursk? Is the Kursk incursion successful? Who knows? At the moment. It certainly has drawn off some Russian reserves, and it's a setback. But again, Russia being a terribly big country they've been able to kind of brush off this and say, well, if you look at the whole map of Russia, and you can't even see this incursion into our territory, so who cares? And they've effectively just contained it as best they can with a few fire brigade units. And then the advantage they do have is being able to use their conscripts in a fight inside Russia legally. So, of course, they've sent their conscripts to fight inside Russia, where they can free them up to do that, which has been a little bit of an advantage to Russia there compared to the SMO itself, Special Military Operation Area itself, where they legally can't use the conscripts, probably do. And of course, they've maintained the momentum in the Donbass before the mud season sets in. So it's a good time to be asking the question, because it's about to get a lot harder to do military operations in the mud season and in the winter to an extent as well, when the focus is on just living in the cold. And so they are really determined, I think, to try and unhinge the Donbass position before mud sets in. The momentum is slowing, but there are some key locations in Donbass I'd like to take back. I think a lot of people in the Ukrainian armed forces are saying, why are we hanging on to towns like Vuhledar? That Ukraine's pretty big as well. We can afford to lose some of these towns and villages without it really jeopardizing our situation. We can straighten the line. We can preserve lives and keep holding on. But of course, this has become a war where the loss of a field or a wood line is being examined in micro detail on social media. Presentationally, no one wants to see the front lines move. So this grinding attacks by the Russians are having an effect, and they'll keep them up. So Kursk, I think, Ukrainian success to an extent, but tactical success, will it lead to an operational strategic success? At the moment, it's not. But to what extent can Russia actually carry on grinding away at unhinging positions in the Donbass, and will that eventually matter, given the other damage being done to the Russian state, and actually particularly the Russian economy at this point? Oil exports and other things will take their toll by the middle of next year. So there is a converging timeline going probably into next spring, summer, hence, again, Zelensky's timeline about a success plan for next year of trying to outlast Russia, and obviously under a new US government of whatever shade, at least being able to go forward in some way and try and get this closed off next year.
Justin Crump, really appreciate your insights and analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.